The war between Russia and Ukraine is bloody. The direct military casualties of this conflict at some point rounded to thousands of combatants per day from both sides, making the battles of this war comparable with the military campaigns that took place 80 years ago. And the war is still ongoing, with no end at sight. The severity of war conflict between Russia and Ukraine, arguably the most cruel war since the end of World War II, perplexes many outsiders unfamiliar with the subject of Russian-Ukrainian relationship. How come Russia and Ukraine are fighting tooth and nail in what looks like existential conflict for both? Today, when the Russian-Ukrainian relationship came into the limelight, it is extremely important to explain the intricate relationship between the two Slavic nations and the reasons why Russia cannot accept Ukrainian sovereignty. As we begin, I will have to tell you that Russia is at war with Ukraine not because of some malicious foreign forces.
Слава Збройним силам України!
As Russia waged an aggressive and deadly war against Ukraine, the world split on those who unconditionally support Ukraine as a victim of an unprovoked aggression and those who show signs of hesitation or even sympathy to Russia. This war boils down to Russian legitimate concerns about their security. The popular pro-Russian narrative goes: if NATO was not expanding to the east, Russia would rust its caves and never ever invaded all those smaller nations. The popular narrative of Russia versus NATO and the hidden American agenda, where Ukraine is just a chess piece of the imperialistic powers, resonates in all those places with strong anti-American sentiment, be it China, Middle East, or even Latin America. In this video, we put aside all foreign influences, even if they do exist, and looked at this conflict from purely Russian-Ukrainian historical perspective. We do claim that imperialist factor does play its role, but it is not American imperialism. For centuries, Russia claimed seniority in the pan-Slavic world. In the modern times, at least since the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, Russia was by far the largest, the strongest, and the most successful state of the Slavic world. However, Moscow's ascendance to power was preceded by centuries and centuries of dominance of Kiev, another center of Eastern Slavic civilization and the capital of Kievan Rus. From the 9th century AD, Kiev was controlling one of the richest European trade routes from the Varangians to the Greeks, connecting Northern Europe with the Eastern Roman Empire. Favorable geographical position enabled Kiev to collect some handsome tribute, which warranted prominence of this city among all Slavic cities. In the 11th century AD, Kiev becomes the capital of Kievan Rus, a powerful medieval state in the east of Europe. After a short-lived centralization, Kievan Rus turns into a federation of principalities where Kiev retains its dominant position as the Grand Principality. Not until Vladimir Suzdal, one of the far-off state on the periphery of the Rus lands and the predecessor of Muscovy, challenged the seniority of Kiev. In 1166 AD, Andrei Boголюбский, the Duke of Vladimir Suzdal, besieged and completely destroyed Kiev. This was an unprecedented act of atrocity in the history of Kievan Rus. Thousands were slaughtered, churches burned to ashes. More importantly for our story, Andrei Boголюбский became the first duke who rejected the Kievan throne after capturing the city. Instead, Boголюбский insisted that his residence in Vladimir was now the center of the federation and its grand principality. This idea did not outlive its master, as the Kievan prestige remained strong after Boголюбский's death and all the way until Mongolian invasion that buried Kievan Rus altogether. In 1240 AD, Kiev fell and was plundered by Mongols. only 2,000 people survived the massacre, and Kiev had never returned to its prominence. In the centuries that followed, almost all Eastern Slavic principalities were integrated in the Mongolian Empire under the Golden Horde. All dukes of former Kievan Rus had to request patents for their thrones from the ruler of the Golden Horde and were subjected to the regular tributes. The time of the Golden Horde marked a momentum for ascendance of Moscow, a part of Vladimir Suzdal Principality that later subdued its own master. Initially insignificant backwoods of the Slavic world, the Moscovian dukes wormed their way in the Mongolian rule, at some point becoming a designated tributary collector on behalf of the Golden Horde in all Rus lands. Gradually, Moscow swallows Vladimir, Suzdal, Ryazan, Novgorod to become the Grand Principality of Moscow, also called Muscovy. In the height of its might, Moscow pushed the Kievan Metropolia of the Orthodox Christian Church to relocate in Moscow. Throughout the Mongolian rule of the 13th to 15th century and further into the 16th century, Muscovy grows in power and size. Ruled by the dukes who followed their lineage from Kiev, the rulers of Muscovy call themselves Duke of Rus. At the same time, the core Kievan Rus principalities, including Kiev itself, followed a completely different and historical trajectory. While Muscovy was capitalizing on its ties with the Golden Horde, cementing its position on the far borders of the Eastern Slavic world and also beyond the Slavic world, all other Rus lands were drifting away from the Golden Horde. The drift manifested in the establishment of the Great Duchy of Lithuania Rus, a powerful federation between Lithuanian Duchy and the core principalities of the former Kievan Rus. Emergence of this new federation put Mongolian rule to an end on the Lithuania Rus lands, some 100 years before Muscovy thrown off Mongolian rule. In 1362 AD, in the Battle of the Blue Waters, a joint Lithuanian Rus forces trounced the Golden Horde's army, liberating almost all territories of the contemporary Ukraine and also Belarus. Subsequently, Lithuania Rus was developing in the spirit of the European medieval kingdom before merging with Poland to become the Polish-Lithuania Rus Commonwealth, also known as Rzeczpospolita, a statehood that lasted until the 18th century. From this point of view, it seemed that Moscow and Kiev separated their path forever, somewhere in the mid-14th century. Moscow was happily evolving into the traditional Oriental despotism, while Kiev was fully engaged in the medieval European feudalism. However, another sharp twist of the historical events brought those two together again. By the 17th century AD, the Polish-Lithuania Rus Commonwealth was riven by the religious conflicts among the Catholic and Orthodox Christians. The feudalist federation of the Polish-Lithuania Rus gradually morphed into a complete dominance of the Polish crown and boosted position of the Catholic Church to the disadvantage of the Orthodox Christians. These tensions led to frequent uprisings of Ukrainian lands against the Polish rule. What was initially internal conflict developed into a full-blown European war involving such countries as Moscovia, Sweden, Ottoman Empire, Austria, the Danish Kingdom, and almost led to a complete disintegration of the Lithuania Rus-Polish Commonwealth. One of the twists of this huge war of all against all was the Treaty of Pereyaslav between Ukrainian leader Bogdan Khmelnytsky and Moscovia that perpetuated allegiance of Ukrainians to the Moscovian Tsar in return for the military support to fight back the Poles. This treaty was signed in 1654 and is treated today as the unification of two brotherly nations by the Russian historiography. In reality, however, Pereyaslav Treaty was a situational alliance that Moscovia broke after just 2 years by signing a separate peace with Poland to jointly fight Sweden. Quite symbolically, Bogdan Khmelnytsky simultaneously formed a military alliance with Sweden to fight Poland. All this after the Treaty of Pereyaslav. Not surprisingly, Ukrainians eventually denounced the treaty, but it was too late. Tasting blood once, Muscovy was not up to any compromises. In the subsequent events that lasted for more than 50 years, still relatively autonomous Ukrainians desperately tried to depart Muscovy by reuniting with weakened Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, making alliance with Sweden and also Ottoman Empire. However, all was futile. With every move to depart, Ukrainian leadership was only forced into signing more and more subordinate treaties with Moscow. In about 100 years after signing the Pereyaslav Treaty, the Institute of Hetmanate, or the autonomous Ukrainian leaders, was finally abolished, and all remnants of Ukrainian autonomy was discontinued in 1775. For Moscovian absolutism, the Pereyaslav Treaty played a decisive role in turning Muscovy into Russia. For the first time in its history, this once godforsaken corner of the Eastern Slavic civilization became a true ruler of all Rus. After incorporating Kiev and other ancient cities of the Kievan Rus state, the Muscovian Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich officially and pompously assumed the title of the Muscovian Grand Duke of Velikoros, Malorus and Belarus, meaning Muscovites, Ukrainians and Belarusians. The son of Alexei Mikhailovich, Peter, whom Russians call the Great, eventually internalized the idea of all Rus nations under the single rule by changing the name of Moscovia into Russia. As you can see, the transformation of Moscovia into Russia was legitimized by the incorporation of the core Kievan lands into the edifice of the Moscovian statehood. Before this, Russian Tsars assumed many titles: the rulers of Kazakh Khaganate, the sovereigns of all Siberia, but not all Rus. Russia is Russia only when it controls all Rus. This is a historical fact. You see how essential is the Kievan tradition to the Russian historiography? Assuming that Ukrainians are independent deprives Russia of hundreds and hundreds of years of history as it is perceived by the Russian elites. Without Ukraine, it throws Russia back in times when it was just Moscovia. Today, Russian high officials call Ukraine an anti-Russian project. It is anti-Russian not only in interpretation of historical events, but also in the civilizational identity. Ukrainians are markedly anti-statist and free-spirited nation. In all their organizational forms, Ukrainians always elected their leadership. In the Kievan Rus times, the highest legislative and juridical authority was not in dukes' hands, but in the hands of people's assemblies. Citizens of the principalities had their say in the matters of electing the dukes, of war and peace, and other most important matters. This comes at odds with the governing principle of the Vladimir Suzdal Principality, the only Eastern Slavic state that always embraced despotism. In the times of the European feudalism between the 13th and 16th centuries, fractured Ukrainian cities, parts of different states, were enjoying the self-governing rights in the vein of the Magdeburg Law provisions, which granted municipal independence rights to the communities in the medieval Central and Eastern Europe. At the same time, Moscovia was undergoing a complete centralization of power, with commoners and nobility alike becoming literally slaves of their sovereign. As an example, even the highest ranks among Moscovian nobles were subjected to humiliating procedures of kowtowing to their master, as well as using all types of self-depreciating names and nicknames when addressing Russian Tsar to prove their utter humility. Ukrainian Zaporozhye Sich, or Kazakh state that rose to prominence as a frontier entity on the border of Rzeczpospolita and the Wildfields, the Black Sea coastal region that divided sedentary inhabitants of Ukraine and steppe nomads of Crimea, is another example of horizontally integrated forms of governance of the Ukrainian people. First, as a frontier entity, Cossacks had quickly become the representatives of all Rus people in Rzeczpospolita. They were the union of free and armed people who elected their leadership and lived according to their rule and law. When the internal war in the Commonwealth broke out, the Cossacks' leadership, in person of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, became a representative of all Ukrainians in signing the infamous Pereyaslav-Rada or Pereyaslav Treaty with Moscovia. The interesting fact was that the treaty was almost thwarted at the signing ceremony, as Cossacks demanded the Tsar to be present, sign the treaty, and vow to the Ukrainian people upon it. Moscovian representatives were perplexed. Russian Tsar vows to nobody, as all under his rule are his servants and slaves. Throughout generations, Russians and Ukrainians evolved under completely different civilizational identities. Incorporation of the Ukrainian, Russian, and later Baltic lands into the edifice of the Moscovian statehood made it an empire, Russian Empire. From this moment onwards, the Russian nobility and clergy were populated by the talented and educated people from these newly acquired territories, ethnical Germans and Balts, Ukrainians and Belarusians. They contributed to the great modernization drive that kicked off with ascendance to power of Peter the Great, who famously cut the window into Europe. Foreigners and the newly acquired subjects of the Russian Empire were the main driving force that transformed the country. The only side to which Russian rulers remained impervious from the foreign influence was the governing principle. Russia remained incurably authoritarian and autocratic throughout the centuries of its modernization and Europeization. For over 300 years that Russia was an empire, this was a stubborn fact despite otherwise European facade that Moscovian state gracefully assumed. With the fall of Russian Empire in the beginning of 20th century, the freed-up nations swiftly built representative parliamentary democracies, be it Finland, Poland, Baltic states, or even Ukraine, that was later conquered by the Red Russia. Russia itself, however, remained autocratic. The party general secretaries replaced Russian tsars, but not vertically integrated governing principle that remained unchanged. The question whether Russia can be horizontally integrated, fully functional democracy is up for discussion. From 1991, Russia remained a democracy for less than 10 years, falling back to its usual practices after the ascendance of the President Putin. Hence, many today remain skeptical about perspectives of Russian people accepting and embracing democracy altogether. Surprisingly, independent Ukraine, with its free-spirited worthiness and neglect of power, creates the largest challenge to the well-established governing principle of the Russian state. Unlike Poland, Finland, even Baltic states that are culturally distant from Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians are the neighboring Slavs with kindred languages, religion, the history of intermarriages, and deliberate mix-up by the relocation policies practiced by Russian Empire and also Soviet Union. Losing Poland or Finland might be painful for Russian self-esteem, but losing Ukraine is something different. It demonstrates an alternative civilizational perspective with unusual clarity. It undermines the governing principles that Russian people deem immutable. If Ukraine can build up a functional and successful democracy, if it can be successful, the Ukrainian example will be instructive for Russian people and will undermine the authoritarian regime in Russia. The intensity of resentment and fear that Russian leadership has against the independent Ukraine was at full display during Putin's infamous speech that preceded Russian invasion in February 2022. In quite an extraordinary fashion, Putin tried to justify the aggression by lamenting about the failed political governance in Ukraine that threw poor brother Ukrainians into misery. Kill Ukrainians to save them, basically. Clearly, Putin and Russian elites are fearful that independent Ukraine not only take away Russian past, but also encroaches on the Russian future. In other words, he's afraid that Ukrainian defection will dent civilizational identity of Russians.
Of Ukrainian borders and add that Ukraine will never be left alone with its problems and challenges.
everything new is just old that has been forgotten. Knowing the history helps us to predict the future, in which respect Ukrainian histories that we just briefly introduced give us fertile ground as of what to expect from Ukraine after it departs from the Russian influence. In 2020, the Lublin Triangle, a regional alliance of the European countries Lithuania, Poland and Ukraine, was formed. The Lublin Triangle initiative invoked the heritage of the 1569 Union of Lublin, which led to establishment of Rzeczpospolita as a union of Lithuanian Rus and Polish lands. The purpose of the old-new alliance is in strengthening mutual economical, political and military cooperation, but more importantly in integration, in supporting the integration of Ukraine into the European Union and NATO. The idea of alliance between the former constituent parts of Rzeczpospolita was entertained by the political figures of both Ukraine and Poland throughout the 20th century, long before formation of the Lublin Triangle. The concept of intermarium as an alliance of the states between the Baltic and Black Sea, or even further to Adriatic Sea, first appeared in the 19th century. After the collapse of Russian Empire in World War I, the countries that regained independence were looking for alliances to cement their precarious positions on the political map of Europe between World War I and World War II. The first Polish head of state, Józef Pilsudski, that took the Ukraines in the 1920s, was the active proponent of alliance between former Russian dominions in the West. The idea never took off due to the skepticism of the Baltic states and the fact that Ukraine and Belarus were already integrated into the Soviet Union by force. A decade later, already Poland and Baltic countries had become the object of aggression by their bellicose neighbors, the Soviet Union and Germany. Therefore, the idea of intermarium was buried for another 17 years until it gained a new momentum, this time tutored by the Ukrainians. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav Chernovil, a prominent Ukrainian politician, the founder of the first non-communist party and the presidential candidate in the first nationwide elections in Ukraine, was one of the most vocal supporters of the intermarium initiative. Yet again, the initiative didn't go further than just talks. Things are starting to change from 2013-2014, when the Russian revanchism became absolutely clear for all its neighboring states. Annexation of Crimea, unimaginable in the global security architecture after World War II, demonstrated that Russia hatches far-reaching plans towards restoration of its influence by force. This made a theoretical alliance between Russian smaller neighbors almost inevitable. After the full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine, Baltic states and Poland became the most dedicated supporters of Ukraine in its war against the aggressor. The four countries allocated the largest portion of military and financial aid as a percent of their national GDP among all countries that support Ukraine. In all likelihood, the alliance between East Slavic and Baltic nations will take shape to counterbalance Russia in the long term, but also to safeguard European Union from the East. Ukraine and Belarus are the two nations that make this alliance viable. Baltic, Poland, Ukraine and Belarus make up to 95 million people in terms of population and almost $1.2 trillion in terms of the cumulative GDP. By all accounts, such an alliance would be a sizable opponent to Russia and would undermine its efforts to regain ground in the Eastern Europe. For the present-day Russia, emergence of intermarium spelled the end to the expansionist dreams and puts to the rest the imperialistic vigor of Russian people. You see now why Ukraine is important to Russia, why Russia cannot accept Ukrainian sovereignty. Without Ukraine, Russian Empire has no past and it has no future. With Russian Empire, Ukraine has no past and no future. In this existential struggle, you have to ask yourself whether you support imperialism. Not American, Russian. You have to ask yourself whether you support Russia asserting itself through the suppression of independent nations. Today, about half of the world is implicitly supporting Russia. This includes China, India, Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. This thing just completely blew my mind. The parts of the world that suffered most from imperialism supports other countries' expansionism so long as it has anti-American flavor. Something to think about, I hope this video can clear some minds and change certain opinions.
Так же, как весь мир боролся с фашизмом. Такая же борьба идет сейчас и с русизмом, и будет усиливаться эта борьба. И напрасно русские думают, что сейчас армией своей, уголовниками, ядерным оружием запугают мир, человечество не запугает. Уже все пуганые, все прошли этот ад русизма, и русских поставят в строй земной цивилизации. Или его не будет как государства, или она должна будет стать в строй мирового сообщества.
In any case, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content, and you can support me by hitting like and subscribing to the channel. See you next time.